Yes. Thanks a lot, Dawn. Hopefully all's all right with my screen sharing there. So great, thank you, Trudy. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. It's really great to see so many people, and thanks also to the Methodology Incubator for hosting. I'm a program manager at the MRC. I look after the Better Methods, Better Research program, which is co-funded by MRC and NIHR. And I think a lot of you might be familiar with the program under its previous name, the Methodology Research Program. We changed the name to try and reflect the fact that we want the underpinning methodology that's being developed really to be taken up and lead to have impact within health research. So just to let you know that not much has changed apart from the name. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the program, both in terms of the budget and the sort of admin side of it, its remit and its strategy. And then I'll talk a little bit about the MRC review process. And then I thought we could stop there for some questions before I move on to giving you some tips that I've gleaned from my time at the MRC about how you could go about writing a grant to the Better Methods, Better Research program. And hopefully that will fit in well with the talks after the break from successful applicants, which I'm really interested to hear from their perspective. So our program has an annual budget of £4 million. And as I said, it's co-funded by the MRC and NIHR. And aside from a small part of the budget that's dedicated to guidance development, we don't have any ring fencing on the budget. So everything we fund is investigator-led. It's coming from the community with the issues they've identified and want to solve. We have 2 funding rounds per year, a deadline in June with a November panel meeting, and a deadline, the next deadline actually is in November, which has a May panel meeting. And we usually receive around 30 to 50 applications and tend to fund 10 to 20% of those. So it's quite competitive. And the types of grants we receive, the majority are investigator-led grants, just sort of standard research grants, but we do also fund industry collaborations, which are called MICAs, MRC Industry Collaboration Agreement, and that's essentially involves an extra step where the industry project partner needs to provide in-kind contributions and make an agreement with the academic partner about intellectual property, essentially. We also fund partnership grants, which are a grant to bring together different partners within a community to try and increase efficiency and outcomes from a particular area. And one of the recent examples from the BMBR program is the Trials Methodology Research Partnership, which I think a lot of you will be familiar with. And finally, I just wanted to talk quickly about NERGs, which are new investigator research grants. And I'm really pleased that Noemi, who received a NERG a couple of years ago, will be giving a talk later. These are they're standard research grants, but the idea is that they're a springboard to independence for researchers. So if you're kind of on the cusp of independence, you can use these to get to the kind of next step of your career. And what we need to see is that you're the intellectual leader of the grant and that you have institutional support. So that's partly to do with underwriting salary, so providing financial support, but equally mentorship and career development opportunities as part of that. Our remit, as I think I've alluded to, involves the development of or improvement of generalizable research methods. And we cover everything across the breadth of MRC and NIHR remit. So a really broad remit. But I think the important thing to note here, or the thing that I often find a misunderstanding with our remit, is that the methods that are being developed need to be generalizable. So they need to be able to be used beyond a single case study. And really, I'll come to this a bit later, but you need to show that developing this method or improving this method will have an impact on the health research that it underpins. Also a note that we don't fund technology or biomarker development as well. So that's just something important to note. As I mentioned, there really needs to be, when you're preparing an application, you really need to show strong evidence that there's a need for the methodology and that there will be an improvement in the research output as a result of this methodology development. And kind of in tandem with that, there needs to be engagement with end users and making sure that there are plans in place for dissemination, for making sure that methods are actually used. Because what we don't want to do is use our relatively small budget to fund, methodology being developed as a sort of intellectual exercise. We actually want it to be used. In terms of strategy, we have multiple stakeholders. So aside from NIHR, which is obviously a funding partner, we also include the devolved nations equivalents for strategy setting. And also we partner with MHRA and NICE. And we hold annual strategy meetings to identify methodological priorities where there are rate limiting challenges. And one of the things that we try to do, again, as I said, we have a fairly small budget, so we're trying to, identify priorities and do what we can to try and bring some improvement to those. And one of the ways we do that is by issuing strategic opportunity notices. And what this means is that within a particular funding round, we'll have a focus, so an area of research where we really want to stimulate applications from the community to try and address a particular challenge. This doesn't mean we still accept all other applications across our remit, but it's just a way of stimulating applications in a particular area. So one recent example of that is in the May deadline, we had opportunity for understanding methodology, qualitative methodology, moving remote during the pandemic, and kind of what best practice is and what the implications are for that. So that had a really great response, and those applications are currently undergoing review and there'll be decisions in November. So that's really exciting. The other thing that kind of forms part of the panel strategy is the development of guidance to develop consensus on particular methods and to use dissemination of that guidance to encourage adoption of best practice. Again, in particular areas where there are methodological challenges or methodological uncertainty. And so we just started this year with a call for that. So we have set aside, as I mentioned, 2 awards of £60,000 each for guidance development. So just really quickly, I just wanted to highlight some key points of the review process from when you submit your application through to the panel meetings and the final decisions. So I'm sure lots of you are familiar with this, but I think for some people it can seem a bit opaque. So I think the important thing to start with is when we receive your application, we'll do a remit check. And if it doesn't fall within our remit, then we'll decline the proposal. And so it's really important that as you're preparing your application, you make sure that it fits the remit. And I'm more than happy for you to send me outlines or kind of summaries of what you're proposing, so I can check the remit and maybe also provide some a bit of feedback on your application as well. I'm more than happy to do that. After that, the application goes through peer review, and those comments, along with comments from panel members, get taken to a shortlisting meeting where maybe 30 to 50% of applications are declined at this stage. And usually that's applications where there are fundamental flaws, and those definitely won't be funded. So the idea is to decline at that stage to give applicants longer to respond to the feedback and perhaps come back in. If you're successful at this stage, you'll have the opportunity to respond to reviewers. And I can't understate the importance of the response to the reviewers. You really need to show that you've taken on board the reviewers' comments, make concessions where necessary, or provide rebuttals where appropriate. And you only have 2 weeks to do this, obviously, because we need to keep the process moving. But this is a really important stage of the application process. And then finally, the panel members meet and score the applications, and a few get funded, which is really great. So we have, as I mentioned, 2 rounds a year for the Better Methods, Better Research programme, which is for full research grants. And the next deadline is on the 11th of November. Hopefully, you'll be sent my slides, and there are links so you can go through to the funding finder to see the opportunity. And after that, there's a June deadline, and then our develop guidance call is annual. So the next deadline for that is the 8th of June. So I'll just stop for a minute here and take some questions. So please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Oh, I think there are questions there already. Oh, and Sam's answered some already. Great, thank you, Sam.
Yeah, so the question came up about a 2-stage process. Would it be possible to say a little bit more about how that might be possible?
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is part of the ongoing conversations that are being had through the, I believe it's called the Simpler Better funding programme. So that's being run out of UKRI Central, and the panel are engaging with that process and feeding into that process as to how we can go about making the process more streamlined. And I mean, I think it's a good suggestion, and I think it's something worth considering, and it's also something that some programs in the MRC already do. Yeah. I'm just looking through the chat, so yeah, definitely, Sean, thanks for the question, and I agree. I think we've had a lot of positive feedback about the COVID calls and the whole process on it.
So there's a question from Hakan Lane about international researchers. Can they apply?
Yeah, so the lead applicant, the PI, needs to be based at a UK institution. That's MRC policy. International researchers can be co-investigators. The process for that is that you need to receive approval from a program manager first. So just email me with what the overseas costs you want to include in your grant are. So whether that's COI time or you know, associated costs, and yeah, I'll look through that and consider approving it. And then when you make the application, you need to make sure that you're justifying the overseas cost in the justification for resources section, because we need to provide assurance to taxpayers as a publicly funded institution that there's a good reason for money going overseas.
So thanks, Roz. I'm just looking through the further comments. There's a bit of a thread of discussion going about the limitation. The quality of applications tends to be good. The limit on the applications is the cap on the funding. And
yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough question. Yeah, I mean, obviously we, at the moment, we're going through the spending review process and getting 1-year settlements. So, I mean, it's not ideal for the MRC in terms of looking for increasing budgets where you have to make multi-year commitments. It's a tough one. And I mean, we really do, as a team, advocate for methodology across the MRC, and you know, we know that there's a issue in terms of budget, and we're trying to work on that, but you know, we we have to work with what we have at the moment.
Exactly, and I think that's what we, you know, as methodologists, it's one of our biggest issues, that we really feel that the investment in general in methodology is just not sufficient. So that's an ongoing campaign, I would say. So there's a question from Anastasia about what about the scope for the definition of methodology? Question about, would you consider proposals that create tools for bringing health data sets together? Or translational research? I don't know if this is... Yeah,
I mean, definitely the translational aspect is something that we're really interested in, and you know, making methodology available. I think there was something on one of the slides about how we fund primary methodology research, but also work that's about making methods more accessible and more available to end users, and particularly those that aren't specialists methodologist. So I think it can depend. There's kind of a bit, there are some areas where the remit is a bit, it can get a bit blurry, or there are some things that are kind of nearer the edges. So I would say if there's something that you have in mind, just send me an email and I'll be able to let you know. In terms of the bringing health data sets together, I think that's a bit more of a difficult one, because obviously if you're talking about like data linkage and that kind of thing, that's really important. And I think it's a really labor intensive work that doesn't have much funding at the moment, but I think that would be kind of generating a big resource, which is kind of less about the methodology, if that makes sense. So I think there does need to be that very methodological focus.
I guess it comes down to that critical definition, doesn't it? So I just wonder if now, shall we pause the questions here and let you get on with the second?
Yes, yeah, I don't have eyes on the time, so I appreciate you doing that, yeah. Okay, great, thank you for those questions. Really interesting. Okay, great. So, yeah, just wanted to give some tips based on what I've seen from applications coming in, and also from Sam's vast experience. So as I was just saying, before your application, it's really important if you have any questions, or particularly about the remit, because as I was saying, there are areas where there's nuance and it is a bit confusing sometimes, to be honest. So feel free to come and talk to us, and do this as far as possible in advance of your application, because getting your application together takes a long time, and you know, there are things that need consideration that will take maybe longer than a month or whatever. So that sounds really obvious, but I think it's something that people forget, that we're here to help you, and we really want to see the best science and the best methodology funded. So my email's at the bottom there, and feel free to get in touch. Along with that, again, far in advance of when you're planning of submitting your application, and along the lines of making sure your method will be taken up, engage those end users and select your collaborators and your team and get all of that together. Another thing is, and I think a lot more departments are offering this now, is the opportunity to have your application undergo internal peer review. And I think your colleagues will provide really insightful feedback, particularly those who are more experienced and who have a lot of experience of the funding process. And just a note that this is an essential step for NERG. So in the letter of support from your department, you need to show that your application has undergone internal peer review. Again, this is seems like a really obvious point, but make sure that your application is clear, both in terms of the content and in terms of the formatting. It goes a long way to present, you know, an 8-page case for support that has enough space to not make it hard on the eyes when it goes in front of reviewers or panel members who have however many other things going on and many other applications to review. And I think it also is worth bearing in mind that because we do cover the whole remit of MRC and NIHR, we have panel members with an extremely broad range of expertise. So we can't cover each individual area of methodology in a huge amount of detail. So we might just have 2 or 3 panel members who share your expertise. And if we get loads of applications in that area, your application might be, being looked at by the other 17 members of the panel who don't share your expertise. So you need to make sure that your application is clear to them and that you're really clearly stating what exists in your field and what methodological gap you want to fill and why you're doing that. Following on from that, when you talk about the methodology you want to develop, make sure that you have a clear plan in place, even if there are aspects of it that are high risk. Making clear the plan, but accounting for the risks and including mitigation strategies is much better than having a fairly uncertain plan. And I think one of the comments that comes up a lot when panel members are talking about applications is that there's a lack of methodological detail. So try and avoid that. Another point is that I think people often think that if they just keep the costs really low, then that will make their application more likely to be successful. And this isn't necessarily the case, because what the panel are looking for is value for money. And what that means is that you need to have adequate resources to do what you say you're going to do, and that those are justified, and particularly making sure that you have enough resources in your grant so that the work can be disseminated and your work can be built on later. Finally, I've talked about this a lot already, but thinking about how the methodology can be implemented and taken up all across the process of the grant, and also how you can demonstrate that you've meaningfully engaged end users throughout the process of designing and developing and then disseminating the methodology. So just before I stop again for questions, I just wanted to talk a bit about the breakout rooms that we're going to go into in a minute. And we thought it would be really great if you could discuss in your breakout rooms and put your feedback onto a Padlet thing that Trudy's going to share the link to in a minute, to talk about how you've recently found out about methods and what aspects of those ways of disseminating methods engaged you. So I've talked about how important the dissemination plan is, but we'd be interested to hear, as methodologists, what are the ways that you find useful for finding out about methods? And then maybe if you have time to think about what creative approaches could be used to disseminate methods that maybe haven't been, you haven't seen, but you think could be useful. And with that, I think we can go back to some questions. And again, my email is there, and feel free to get in touch if you have any more questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Roz. That's really, really very informative. There are actually quite a lot of questions coming through on the chat. one theme that's been sort of echoed quite a lot is that has been raised by Paula and Sue. You know, what can the methodological community do to influence budget setting? Don't know if we want to.
Yeah. Should I stop sharing my screen? Is that
oh yes,
helpful? Okay. Yeah, that's a really great question. I think one thing that I think would be really great is for us to be able to develop an evidence base about what the problems are, because I think we have a lot of anecdotal evidence, you know, things that we've heard again and again for the community. But I think we're at the stage now where we need to have a really clear evidence for what the issues are, so that when we present the need for more funding, you know, we kind of have a leg to stand on. And I think that's something that we've talked about, and I think that is something that I think the methodology incubator is already trying to do. And I think if the community can get involved with those initiatives, I think that would be really great.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's a sort of, you know, what specifically what evidence would be persuasive, because I feel there's a lot of, it doesn't seem to be, while there's many funders that are very sympathetic to methodological research, it's sort of not quite anyone's key responsibility champion it. It's always sort of at the intersection.
Yeah.
And I think sort of mapping out where the funding is happening, where the gaps are, and then lobbying for the increase, because I think we all feel it's so unbelievably modest, the amount of funds that are dedicated to methodology.
Yeah.
But basically we have to keep sort of being positive about, well, if you did allocate more budget, this is the impact, this is the difference.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think also, I think we're at a really good moment in terms of getting that message out there. I mean, in terms of, you know, COVID and trials methodology and health data and the kind of methodology that needs to be underpinning that. I think it's becoming kind of more of a topic that people are aware of. So I think now is maybe a good time to try and push a bit harder.
Thanks. I'm wondering, there are actually quite a lot of questions, and it might, if we went to the breakout rooms now and allow people to do the discussion, it would give you some time, Roz and maybe Sam, to just look through these questions to think a bit more about some responses when people come back. Would that be acceptable?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll do that now. So the idea is that we're all going to be sent into random small breakout rooms, and the Padlet that Trudy has shared at 10:37 in the chat, that has like 3 little pads on it for you to put suggestions on it, and we'll basically use that to reflect on after the break, after we come back from the breakout rooms. If you would maybe like to say more about your comment, you can put your name on the comment, but if you just want to put a comment and remain anonymous, that's absolutely fine. Is that fair to say that, Roz?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, that's great.
Okay, so I think at this point then we'll go to the breakout rooms, which I think are set for 15 minutes, and then we'll all come back. So basically it's just going to be random. You can chat amongst yourselves, think about the questions, and do a little bit of networking before we come back and deal with the questions in the chat.
And Dawn, Rosalind, Sam and Nicola, you've agreed to kind of facilitate, so you'll all be allocated to a breakout room. So once you know that your breakout room is okay, If you can just come back to the main room, so there'll be a button on the bottom right of your screen to leave the breakout room. Do make sure you just leave the breakout room to come back to the main room, and don't actually leave the meeting entirely. If you do, you can obviously just join again. But just if those 4 people, Dawn, Roz, and Sam and Nicola, could just come back, and then we'll make sure somebody gets around all of the breakout rooms just to make sure everybody's okay and you've got the Padlet link and you know the questions, etc. Yeah, I'll open the rooms for you.